Crunching data, that's the key to really understanding how governments work. Digging out unique narratives, then telling the story. And putting a voice to all that data? Well, that's the job of the monthly with Senator Pamela Wallin.
Hello and welcome. I'm Pamela Wallin, your moderator. Today on the monthly, the age of uncertainty, how the world can, and I suppose must, adapt to a riskier future. Our guest, Stephen Poloz, the former governor of the Bank of Canada. But before we begin, let me bring in your host today, Greg McDougall, who together with Steve Saunders are Government Analytics. Greg?
Thank you, Senator, and thank you, Stephen, for joining us. It's really great, a great opportunity to have you here. And again, Government Analytics is just really honored to have this level of discussion and around policy decisions, and anything we can do to advance that type of debate is what we're all about, actually. So again, on behalf of Steve and I, thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you, Greg. So let's begin. After 13 years with the Bank of Canada, Stephen Poloz went on to become the president of EDC, Export Development Canada. Then in 2013, full circle, he was appointed to the top job as the governor of the Bank of Canada. At the end of his 7-year term, Stephen then joined the board of directors of Enbridge and the law firm Osler, Hoskin and Harcourt as a special advisor. He's also been busy working on his upcoming book to be released early next year. It's titled The Next Age of Uncertainty, How the World Can Adapt to a Riskier Future. Welcome. It's great to see you in your new life, in your new digs. When you are talking about the world and the uncertainty that is there, that obviously we must cope with, you're talking about much more than the pandemic caused uncertainty.
Yes. Hey, thanks for having me on, Pamela. It's great to see you, and it's been too long. Yes, everybody could see, I think, that volatility or uncertainty in the environment that we make business decisions or policy decisions have been rising long before COVID came along. COVID, of course, is a natural shock of the first order. It's been dreadful. And it's not over yet. But what I think is doing is, in some cases, accelerating some of the forces that were already at play. Things like technological progress, which was there. The fourth industrial revolution was underway, but my goodness, as you can see what we're doing right this moment, it has accelerated all those that deployment of the next generation of technology. So those are the forces that I think are going to give us rising levels of volatility and therefore uncertainty as we move forward.
When you talk about technological advances, it obviously raises the question of jobs as well. We've seen an awful lot of people go back home and start working there, and now many people don't want to go back. There was an article I read the other day about hundreds, if not thousands of people have simply decided to quit their jobs, that this is, not how they want to work. That may be good news for the millennials who are waiting for all the boomers to get the heck out of the way. But that is also an issue because we've got an aging workforce.
Yes. So we have an aging workforce. It's really picking up speed now because folks like myself, we were born in the mid-50s. During the mid-50s to the mid-60s, we had this gigantic bulge in global population, not just here in Canada. And that's a 50-year bulge. And now we're going down the backside of that. And so labor force growth is slowing quite significantly globally. And of course, Canada, bit of an offset from immigration. Immigration is the most important ingredient to prevent it from falling. I don't know how people just decide they're no longer going to work because they enjoyed working from home so much. I mean, the economics go contrary to that.
Exactly.
But what I think is definitely going to emerge is some sort of a hybrid model, depending on the company, depending on the individual. You'll see a variety of arrangements emerge. And so to me, that's a positive. If you build the labor market around a standard, let's say 40-hour week, and it's all at the office. Well, that creates a certain constrained outcome, But if instead, using technology, people can choose to work 1 day a week at the office, 4 at home, or 4 days a week all the time, or all these kinds of different combinations, that's going to be good both for firms and for people. And so I expect this is going to generate higher productivity in the economy as a whole as we move to that hybrid model. Mostly, though, what you mentioned, though, is technology can, of course, disrupt the job market. And we've seen that for the first 3 industrial revolutions, and we'll see it again. We are seeing it now in the 4th. And what I think that gives rise to is perpetual K-shaped expansion in the economy. People, are disrupted. They go to the bottom part of the K. The top part of the K is the new technology, and the companies that use the new technology, they grow faster, but other parts of the economy get dragged down. And our job is to help people move from the bottom part of the K to the top part of the K. That's always been the case. And in fact, in every other industrial revolution, that has happened. It takes time, of course. So there's not saying there's no pain from disruption, because there is. These are real people that get disrupted. But every time in the past, we've had more jobs created than were destroyed by technology.
Do you share the concern of many, certainly on the governing side, that we are seeing a rising income inequality in this country? I don't know whether the stats genuinely indicate that. We did see through the pandemic many people who couldn't have lasted a month or 6 weeks without income, just couldn't meet the basic payments. Has that kicked up for some reason that you can assess?
Well, the big trend, Pamela, is that for our generation, income inequality globally has declined substantially, and that is comparing one country to another. But within countries, income inequality has tended to increase. And it's very demonstrable when you hear of these gigantic incomes in the high-tech, entrepreneurs and that kind of thing. And that, of course, makes the perception maybe bigger than the reality. Canada is quite a significant exception. That in fact, in the last 5 to 10 years, we have had a decline in income inequality, while in the US, there's been a significant increase in income inequality. This is primarily due to the tax systems. And, in particular in Canada, when you make even a relatively small wage, you pay income taxes, but you also receive the Canadian benefit package, right? What we used to call the baby bonus when I was a kid. That income is, people think of it as an income from the government, but really what it is, it makes taxes negative down at the bottom part of the income scale. And so actually, according to the OECD, Canada has one of the lowest points, the highest income levels at which income taxes are still zero. So we are very equality driven, I would say, in our tax system. It doesn't look that way to people because it's all these programs floating around instead of a simple negative income tax at the bottom, which is how an economist might design it. But it sounds more complicated to people. And I suppose politics is what it is. You have to get the job done.
Just on that point, I've got to ask you about the guaranteed basic annual income. It's changed names 100 times in the last 30 years. Is that a concept you think is a good idea?
Yeah, the concept of a basic income, a guaranteed basic income, I'm one of those that thinks that could be a more efficient way of going about things. I don't suggest it. I don't dismiss the claims that will cause some people not to want to work. That's of course that's possible. I don't dismiss that, but I think it'll be a very small minority. But what we have today is all kinds of federal and provincial programs that people would apply to for one reason or another. And imagine if we just replaced all of those in much the way that they did during the crisis when they created the CERB.
Exactly.
With one stroke of a keyboard, bang, we had this thing with your connection through CRA, money in your account almost instantly. That was an amazing feat, by the way, for Ottawa Mandarins to pull off. And it just shows you the power of technology there, right there. So imagine if all the inefficiencies, and when you used to have to qualify for EI with all these questions and so on, and then you had your waiting period, and every couple of weeks prove that you were still looking and all that. Imagine replacing all of that structure with this simple thing and designing it in a way so that there are still strong incentives to boost your income, to go to work and boost your income. I think that's easy to design, frankly, and I think it would be a far more efficient way of delivering public health, public income benefits. But anyway, that's, of course, that's theoretical.
Yep.
The real world, we've got a more complex system. And I think the CERB kind of showed us the way that, things could be run differently, perhaps in the future.
Well, I've raised the issue because we're hearing your successor at the Bank of Canada talk about these issues, talk about environment, talking about income inequality, and we have seen through their actions support not in terms of buying government bonds, not just for the pandemic crisis, but to support the programs that governments are increasingly involved in terms of redistribution of income. Do you see that as a little bit of mandate creep, or is the world just different now?
Well, without commenting on current issues that are in front of the Bank of Canada, I swore never to do that to my successor.
I know.
And that's a code. But I think there of course there is the risk in the central banking community. There is always a risk of mandate creep. And we know though that foundationally, inflation targeting has proved to be the best contribution that the central bank can make to the environment in which we behave, or the environment we live in. The old Tinbergen analysis was you have one instrument, that's an interest rate. Well, you can really only have one target, and that has converged upon inflation for central banks. And that's the one thing that central banks for sure can control. All the other things are almost like, if you like, second order variables that may be influenced along the way, because targeting is not, a rifle shot. It is what it is a series of successive approximations where you're deciding in real time and leaning this way and leaning that way. Well, those judgments can be influenced by a wider range of variables, such as, is the labor market actually fully employed, or is it still underemployed? Should we be taking more risk in that direction to get us to a better long-term position? Is financial stability growing as an issue? Should we lean against that a little bit? So those kinds of things introduce kind of a fogginess around that simplistic inflation targeting mantra. But that fogginess is always present to some degree, and it's about judgments around it. And in the end, you kind of have a lot of things that kind of go into the mix, and you take them into account, which is not the same as targeting them, right? And so I think that's more the kind of, again, it's almost a hybrid kind of situation. And right now, of course, given what we've been through, I would say that the performance of the labor market is top of mind, because the longer the disruption from COVID goes, the more scarring there would be in the labor market, and therefore the more potentially permanent effects on work practices and so on that would emerge. So the faster we can get back to normal, the less scarring there will be. Very similar to recovering from an ailment. When the surgeon does the best work, you recover quickly. And that means you've got less long-term effects, and the economy is the same.
The bank owns nearly 50% of Government of Canada bonds, and we all understand that had to happen in pandemic times. Just the spending alone was so massive. But where do we see the line, or can you determine the line? And I guess this goes to your point about many of these things are judgment calls, where it moves from support from pandemic crisis to support for government spending. And I put that in the context. We've had a couple of discussions on this program about MMT, and whether that's the theory. Stephanie Kelton was with us, and she said we just have to think about debts and deficits in a whole other way. That, you know, deficits matter, but we really just have to get out of this notion of thinking constantly about balancing the books. It's just not today's way of thinking.
Okay, well, there's a lot of questions buried in there.
There are, you can pick a couple.
Yeah, so yeah, initially, when the crisis hit, job one for central bank is to ensure that financial markets continue to function, to do their job. And of course, when buyer and seller can't find one another, you know, the seller wants cash for one reason or another and can't get it, well, the liquidity has evaporated. That's what happens. And so being a ready buyer of financial assets like government, I mean, the government debt market is foundational to all the other credit that goes through the system. And so it has to be functioning well for anything to function well. And so that's what you become crisis management. That tool is, of course, always used to create as much liquidity as the system needs or wants. And, you know, picture a company, it doesn't matter, a big corporate name, they don't have a lot of cash on hand because they've got credit lines, perhaps with 10 different banks.
Right.
And so their board is saying, we need to make sure we have cash, you know, because we got to weather the storm. So they draw their credit lines. Well, where does that money come from? It's not lying around in a bank. The bank has to go out on the market and fund that. And therefore, if the markets are seized up, they can't. So back in 2008, banks had to cut credit lines in the middle of a crisis. Well, we didn't want that happening this time, and it didn't. It didn't because the banks did a terrific job. And what that means is the banks actually borrow from the Bank of Canada in order to get the liquidity they need and pass it down to the companies. That functioned perfectly and it calmed things down quite rapidly. So there's job one. The next phase, though, what that same operation does is it helps to push down longer term interest rates. I don't know about you, but I've never been able to borrow overnight. But that we always talk about the overnight rate, and that's the very front end. And that's the thing the central bank affects. But then there's all these other rates that people actually pay, which are higher and higher and higher, going out the curve, we call it. So a 5-year mortgage, for instance. So if you want the mortgage market to be more liquid and to expand, well, you need to suppress the 5-year rate. And that's what these purchases do. They squeeze a little bit more of the stimulus out into the longer part of the credit market. So all of that is perfectly natural. Those are conventional tools. Now you're asking a different question related to Stephanie Kelton's work. And I got to say, I'm not a fan of this. And I would just put it this way. The idea there is when you have governments need money every day. So they should just print as much money as they need and spend it. And of course, that means issuing debt to the central bank. That's, you know, so central banks create money that way every single day. Every time the government issues money, debt, that's what they do everywhere, not here, everywhere. And so what's new about that? Well, nothing. And then if you read the fine print of the modern monetary theory, it says, well, you can't do that without a limit. You can only do it until inflation starts.
Correct.
Well, by that metric, Pamela, I would say for the last 25 years, the central bank here in Canada has been creating just the right amount of money to keep inflation at 2%. That's exactly what has occurred. So and now since the crisis, they've been creating more because they're filling in a deflationary gap, and that's exactly the right thing to do. That's not modern. We knew that since Keynes in 1936, Pamela. That's not a modern monetary theory at all. I'm afraid they've kind of taken common sense and flipped it on its head and say, you're looking at it upside down. And so I'm not really seeing the insight there. Sorry.
Yeah, and it is, I mean, it just is as long as the interest rates are low, you can just keep borrowing because it's so cheap to do that. That's the theory. But now what we're seeing, of course, is interest rates starting to move. Jerome Powell of the US Fed sort of raising a flag in the last couple of weeks, the numbers here. What is your level of concern about where we're headed with inflation and interest rates?
Well, look, if interest rates begin to lift, mainly what has happened, what will happen is bond yields will lift first, I think, because that's, Mother Nature doing it as opposed to the central banks. We saw some of that during the winter, as you know, into the spring, and we've had a bit of a retreat in the last few months. But what that should be seen as a very positive sign. It's a symptom of success. If the economy and inflation is normalizing, then interest rates, let's face it, interest rates aren't going to remain at zero forever. That I hope not, because it'll mean the economy remains underwater for a long time. So signs of normalization, that will be one of them. And that's to be encouraged. It's that you don't have to race there. You just let the economy do the work. And Mother Nature will raise interest rates in the credit markets all by herself. And so I'd be looking forward to that, because that'll mean all the things that have gone wrong have begun to repair themselves. And we know there's plenty that has happened, which is good in the economy. It's doing well, actually, overall. And there are some gaps still. And of course, it's all related to shutdowns. The really good news is every time we've shut the economy down, it's been like stopping the clock. And then when we open it up again, it starts right up again. And it has not, the old story about the recession is when you see your next door neighbor lose their job, they, of course, stop spending their money. Mm-hmm. But you always think, gee, maybe I'll lose my job too. So you start to spend less money too, even though you haven't lost your job. That's how a recession spreads around and becomes hard to reverse. It's the sentiment. But if you go through a thing where your next door neighbor works in the entertainment business or something, they've been shut down over and over and for long periods of time, but you're in the car production business. Well, okay, you didn't lose your job and you kept producing cars, a bit of fluctuations and so on. But point is, you never felt that those shutdowns were going to affect your business. So it doesn't permeate and you don't get this weight of sentiment holding you back. That's why the economy has outperformed economists' expectations throughout the past year. It's because they've been modeling it like a normal recession when it hasn't even been close to one.
That's a really interesting point. The other side of that, though, is people are feeling the inflation in goods and services, some of which are not counted in the price index, whether it's food or energy or things like that. And so it's real. I mean, I'm sitting here in an agricultural community. We've got our own problems here with a drought that has knock-on effects just everywhere. The energy sector had already been in some trouble. You can't build a deck on the front of your cabin because the lumber is too expensive. The prices in the stores on groceries are already going up. So there is that not only psychological sense, but there's a real sense that people are seeing.
Well, there's no question about this. Again, the first pass on this is that prices going up is one of the symptoms of success. Mm-hmm. Prices going down is a dreadful situation, where there's so little demand that things are falling off a cliff. And of course, that's where we were last summer.
Yeah.
So last spring and summer, there was a lot of deflation, lots of observations of deflation. And I dare say there were almost no articles written about it. No one gets excited about it when it goes down. Well, when a price goes down, and then it comes back up again, then we get all the articles about the inflation. Instead, all it's really is normalizing. Yeah. So now I know I'm generalizing, and that's unfair. Yeah. You mentioned lumber as an example. So lumber went up to like $1,600 for however many board feet of, I forget how many, it's 1,000 board feet or
For
something.
this much.
Oh, for
yes.
2x4. But I'll just note that the price of lumber wholesale now is down below where it was before the pandemic. Now it'll take a little longer for it to get to your store where you go pick it up, but that store now is buying lumber cheaper than they were before the pandemic. So at some point, it's gonna their inventory will be gone and they'll be charging a much lower price.
Yeah, so they're selling it at the price they paid it for, but that's my sense that people are still feeling it, but you're
Yes.
saying that's very temporary.
That's exactly right. So commodities are almost never a source of persistent inflation because you can always produce more of them. And that's what happened with lumber. It's what happens with oil. It's what's happening with nickel and copper. Production is picking up. You know, a year ago, economists said this would be the worst recession since the Great Depression. Well, that was obviously hyperbolic. It was nothing of the sort. It was a 2-month recession. Well, so now that was a spectacularly bad call, frankly, from the economics profession. So now we go, what are we going to talk about now? Well, let's talk about inflation because that's the opposite of the worst recession since the Great Depression. Inflation is the new risk. Now, I'm not dismissive of it. We need to be careful here. Mistakes can happen in this situation. There are a lot more unknowns than usual. And of course, the labor market, as we discussed earlier, is one of the biggest ones. So I don't want to treat it lightly, but I do think that the fundamentals do not scream at me inflationary. The longer term concern, as you mentioned before, is about government debt and do central banks somehow get co-opted into creating more inflation years from now, like what happened in the 1970s. You know, I have a lot of faith in central banks. I don't think so. But that's a risk that at least investors and householders need to take seriously, more seriously than they have since the 1970s, just because of all that debt. But that's a risk and still a tail risk. It's not the main scenario.
I guess one of the reasons that there feels like there's so much uncertainty is as you noted, the pandemic is not yet over and we're not sure which twists and turns will happen. But the private household debt in Canada is extremely high, $2.5 trillion. And what kind of stunned me was 68% of that debt is mortgage debt, in part because of the pandemic surge that people wanted to have a house with a yard or move out of the apartment if they were going to be at home for the next 5 years with their 3 kids. Is that a troubling number for you?
Well, as a central banker, you're always trained to worry about everything. And of course, household debt almost always made the top of the list. You worry that if we had a real recession, as opposed to a stop the clock recession that we had, if we had a real recession that meant cumulative job losses over a year or 18 months, and then finally a recovery, that during that period, there's so much debt that people might lose their houses because they've lost their job for a long time, or that interest rates might surprisingly, pop up, a few percentage points. That, of course, would make it really stressful for all those folks. Those are the things that you worry about, of course. But let's look at it from the other side. I mean, I don't know about you, but in my lifetime, I've paid a lot of interest. I mean, when I got my first house, I was so excited that I got that rate of 12%. That was a low rate offered by the builder.
Yeah.
I
paid a lot more than that.
I know. I'm just saying. So imagine, our kids faced with this once in a lifetime opportunity, to advance their plan, to take on the debt now as opposed to waiting, say, 4 years from now when maybe rates will be higher. And possibly house prices will be higher again. So I got to believe, though, that in the end, I mean, this is a fluctuation. Okay, you got to remember that we aren't back to normal. So we shouldn't extrapolate everything that we're seeing. We're already seeing the housing market kind of calming down after that surge that you mentioned. So let's wait and see in the fullness of time. I do worry more about the accessibility of housing. I
Well,
do
that's the
think,
other number.
yeah,
Canadians need somewhere between 10 and 34 years of savings just for their down payment.
yes, and I think that is a significant issue, especially it goes to your first question about inequality. You know, that's one of the symbols of equality, that, you know, that home
Yeah,
ownership is an
yeah.
accessible channel. And so this, I think, is begging for more innovation in financial intermediation. You know, I think that there are ways of perhaps innovating in the mortgage market. I don't think mortgages have really changed in my lifetime. Uh, Concepts such as shared equity mortgages, which
Mhm.
Mian and Sufi popularized in their book, I think it was called The House of Debt. So some of those things may have found their time. You know, that maybe we'll see more of that. Just necessity is the mother of invention,
Yeah.
and we face this major challenge. But also, let's bear in mind too that folks like me who have a lot of high-priced real estate now. You know, someday I'm not going to need all that. You know, my kids will stand to benefit. That maybe later in their lives that they benefit compared to when my parents passed on and left a small bit of real estate for us. But you know, that real estate doesn't get destroyed. It's a wealth stock that then finds its way through the channels to the next generation. I'm not saying everybody can look forward to that, but I know that some of that debt that you're referencing is bound to get reversed when those legacies find their way to those, let's say, 50-year-old or 60-year-old folks whose parents die when they're 90, let's say.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a lot of wealth that's going to be transferred to that generation as we go forward. And so let's also bear that in mind, Pamela. This, you know, when you take out a huge mortgage, you do it in the knowledge that one of these days you're going to get a little something. And anyway, you know, mom and dad lived with a great big mortgage, and look how they
Yeah.
did. You know,
Yeah.
it's
Which is maybe how we're thinking about the country too, which is,
yeah,
gets us back to that other. I want
yeah,
to I want to take a look at the energy sector, which is so crucial in this country, providing the basis, the financial basis for so much of the expenditures. Um, so we've got a couple of things going on around the world. We're seeing new oil and gas mega projects everywhere. It's just really not happening here, as the government of the day keeps the focus on the greening of the economy. I know that's going on everywhere, but we take a pretty direct hit in this country. One statistic that I read here, the world requires $525 billion worth of new oil and gas investment per year to meet current demand. And we're just not getting that investment in this country for a lot of reasons we could cite. Are you troubled about where we are when you think that, I guess it's about in the last decade, oil and gas has contributed $500 billion to government revenues?
yeah. Well, it contributes far more than that to our economy,
Yes, indirectly.
and many jobs and so on. I mean, fact is that the world economy has a carbon backbone, and I accept the green aspirations. I accept the notion of getting to 2050 and some sort of net zero kind of state, so that we put a lid, as much as humanity is able to put a lid on global warming. It's not 100% clear that global warming will stop if we do that, but at least it's worth us doing. And so I accept all of that as a premise, but now let's add reality to it. So 80% of the energy needs globally today are fulfilled with fossil fuels. And even if we get to net zero by 2050, which I hope and expect, my guess is we'll still be using fossil fuels for close to half of our energy needs. Our energy needs are are big and they're going to continue to grow. And until we discover dilithium crystals, which is what they use on Star Trek for energy, I think that, or some other magic
I
alternative.
think we have some in northern Saskatchewan. I'm pretty
Well, I
sure.
hope that. I hope that. So the point is that the reality is that we need to reconcile that carbon backbone with that 2050 aspiration. And for me, the most obvious thing to do that, and one of the most important, is carbon capture and storage. And so I think Canada, being an energy leader, has a chance to be an energy transition leader and to sink big resources into carbon capture as a demonstration of that ability, and therefore to be able to sustain those resources long into the future. You watch Star Trek, there's all kinds of stuff made out of plastic. We know where that's coming from, Pam. I mean, there's no question about that.
But there's no sense from the federal government there. I mean, certainly in the case of my own province here, carbon capture is not just being recognized as the kind of contributor it should be to the greening process.
Well, I think we have to wait a little bit longer to see, but I do note that there was a significant dollar amount attached to CCUS in that last budget. That was a very welcome development in my mind, and I know that the sector is rallying around that, and there's a lot of consultation happening right now. Like, okay, so what does it look like in the next stage? So imagine if you have a carbon tax, if it goes to $170 as projected, what a great business it would be in to do reverse mining, to capture carbon out of the atmosphere and put it into a form that can be buried again in all kinds of space down there. And so you make great money doing that while continuing to use that fossil fuel kind of source of energy. Because I mean, put it the other way, to replace the use of natural gas, which again, I grew up thinking natural gas is one of the cleanest things you could use. And actually it is, but of course it still emits carbon. Of course it does, carbon dioxide. So, but imagine replacing all the natural gas with, say, electricity. Well, you might need, in Ontario alone, 50, 60, or 70 new nuclear plants. I mean, are we going to get the permits for that? I mean, are we going to be able to put the money against that? If you convert every vehicle to electricity, well, where's the electricity going to come from? For all that. So the reality is, I think we're going to need to manage this differently and take the net of net zero very seriously. It doesn't mean going to zero on every aspect, right? That, in my mind, anyway. So look, we've always found a way around these things, to make reality happen. And I think we can, but when you mix politics into it, of course, not just politics, but let's say polarized politics.
Politics, exactly.
It makes it very hard to find these solutions, in a public sector way.
As we see the US canceling pipeline projects. And I was just reading, as I know, this massive document, the so-called infrastructure bill coming out of the US, but one of the things there, and this always makes me nervous, is that to address the need for additional revenue for surface transportation infrastructure, maybe we should be looking, says the document, at a motor vehicle per mile user fee. Do you think that, these kinds of things are actually going to have to be considered if we're going to pay? It's not clear that the green economy is generating the money or the jobs that we need to fund the objective.
Well, that's an interesting area for speculation. I don't have a strong view on it, but I know that gas taxes are an important source of revenue. If you convert all the cars to electric, you won't get that anymore. And so that's why you're talking about having to, so if you buy a hybrid car like I have, you use literally half as much gas as my old car. That's half as much as emissions too, by the way. It seems like I drive, and then it costs $32 to fill it up again. It's literally half as much as before. Well, if all cars were hybrid, couldn't we reduce emissions tremendously? While at the same time allowing, we're not destroying that carbon backbone that we talked about before.
Yeah.
And then deploying carbon capture at various other stages of the supply chain to somehow find our way to net without literally blowing everything up, and meaning that, I guess it means that we have to reduce our use of energy. I'm not sure how we cause that to happen. And that would be a major retreat in living standards and so on. I'm confident that technology is going to help us get there, but we're going to have to invest big in the technology as opposed to, just expanding the number of acres and acres and acres of solar panels, which, by the way, those are acres that we would rather use to grow soybeans and so on.
To grow product.
Yeah.
No, that's the issue. And I mean, it's the same as you talk about nuclear in Ontario. I mean, and we're talking about it here with other provinces, the small reactors that you can take to a work site or a plant site, that kind of thing must be incorporated as well.
Agreed.
Yeah. Okay, so I know you're penning this book, and you still seem, as the title suggests, to be an optimist about this.
Yes, they used to call me Sonny Steve, when I first became governor. And in my book, I explore a little bit the underlying reasons for that. And I think mainly, Mother Nature has always shown us the way in the past. It's not everything that we live with today was orchestrated by governments or policymakers. The vast majority of it happens through Mother Nature. And just to illustrate, if you think governments around the world are all suddenly going to agree on how we get to 2050, I think you've got another thing coming. There's just not enough of a consensus around that. But what is happening is that investors are forcing a pace to 2050 through their investments, through their portfolio adjustments. And companies are responding to those pressures, showing us explicit actions that they're going to take, incenting their executives and issuing bonds that pay off bigger if they fail to meet their greening initiatives. That's major progress. And so I think in the end, it's the companies that will do most of the work of getting us to 2050 net zero, but you need to give them the flexibility to do it there and take the net, as I mentioned, seriously. It's, and you can't suddenly say, well, then all this has to be zero suddenly. No, you have to let them optimize and still deliver for us. And I think that it's going to work all by itself, with supporting government regulations, without the government, being the guiding hand that makes every decision. That's what I think. So that's a form of optimism. And I think the technology that you and I have seen in our lifetime, how could we possibly be pessimistic about what's going to happen in the fourth industrial revolution? I mean, this is just too big and too amazing for us to be worse off, to have our kids be worse off than they are today.
Okay, but let me just raise a couple of points, because you're making I think how most of us want to see the world is leave the developing the new expertise to the experts. The market will decide what the price of carbon should be, and the market will decide what industries grow and where the investment dollars come. But we're seeing on both sides of the border governments that have signaled and are acting in a way to show that they intend to be very interventionist when it comes to deciding this path. And we've also got a lot of other social pressures. It's not just the green pressures, it's the decisions that companies now have to make, which aren't always financially the right decision to make, to be more socially conscious and aware and change their management structures and have minority groups reflect. Like, there's all these forces, and that is counter to what you're saying.
Well, I don't really think it's counter.
Okay.
What I think is that what I described around climate change and emissions as one channel across what I would consider to be a broader spectrum of socially aware kinds of capitalism. People call it stakeholder capitalism and so
Right.
on. And I think, by the same token, I mean, if you, let's say you as a company, you do a great job on your emissions because your investors tell you to, but you treat your employees badly, or you just pay minimum wage and you fire them when you want and all. Well, that would, in an environment where inequality is one of the top of mind issues for people, I don't think investors will tolerate that either. And so I think the kinds of companies that succeed will be ones that manage risks across a wide array of fronts, not just bottom line risk, but risk associated with the things you're raising. Climate is obviously one, inequality is another, the capability of having your dreams come true, owning a home and all those kinds of things, and uncertainty about your job future. All those kinds of things will be right on the plate of the company. Because I think over time, governments are going to be quite stressed dealing with this level of debt that they're starting with, and the aging of the population, growing needs for an elderly population. I think it's going to be tough for governments to manage all those things.
Yeah.
So I think you shouldn't be pessimistic about that. Yes, there will be points where there's contention, of course, and there's going to be differences between countries, and that'll cause problems, but none of those are big picture problems. I think those are kind of implementation problems.
Interesting. So does Sunny Steve wish he had been at the helm through the crisis we're living through, or was Sunny Steve sort of relieved that his 7-year tenure had come to an end?
Well, to be honest, I mean, I was there for the first 3
Yeah.
months, and
Yeah.
so the crisis was, in terms of a financial crisis, if we ever really had one, we nipped it in the bud, I think. So it was managed, not just here, but as in collaboration with other central banks. I think a good job was done. And I was watching it from a bit more of a distance. I'm glad to see things turning out as we hoped they would. The economy has proved its resilience, by the way. That's a really important thing. We got hit by this shock at a time when the economy was in the best shape it had been in for at least 20 years. So we're lucky that we started from there, just like a healthy individual can manage COVID better than an unhealthy individual.
Yeah.
It's the same. So I'm enjoying my new chapter, a little extra flexibility and much more variety. And of course, now I can be a bit of a spectator in something a sport that I used to play every day, and it's fun.
It's been great to have your view from the outside with your knowledge from the inside combined, and we're all looking forward to the book. I just want to, before we say goodbye, just see if Greg wants to come in with any comments before we wrap this up.
Thank you very much, Senator, and thanks for joining us. It's great, and it's a great dialogue. The senator once in a while lets me ask a question, which is really well received on this end. And so I just wanted to circle back on inequality you spoke about and the challenges and the role effectively of our central bank and others moving into this space. And it's that equilibrium that is being adjusted, I think, from a policy side of it, or as a policy wonk, Steve and I work on government analytics is trying to figure out where the policy direction's headed based on the numbers that we're crunching. And so there's only so much power, there's only so much decision making with central banks and with governments. It seems that if a central bank were to move into this space of engaging a bit more than just monetary policy, but providing commentary on certain issues. Infrastructure was one I think you're quite familiar with. Others, does that not push into the space of an organization like Finance Canada? And again, I'm not asking you to comment on the current situation, but generally globally, as central banks become a bit more activists, and they needed to help resolve the crisis, does that not put the people engaged or actively assigned the role of being engaged in fiscal policy, does that now crunch into their space, into their area a little bit?
Well, this is, I think, where Pamela was going with the mission creep kind of notion. And of course, one of the things, if you look at the longer period, say since the global financial crisis, I think after 2008, 9, 10, people became quite enamored with how central banks kind of managed that. And so you kind of think, boy, central banks can really manage a lot. That's maybe giving a little too much credit, in my view, for what Mother Nature did most of the work. So if you think the central bank can fix lots of things in sight, you don't have to force governments or hope governments will fix everything. Let the central bank do it. I think that's taking on too much, and it runs the risk of the central bank venturing into political kind of ground. I mean, it's where the accountabilities are much more political than technical. And so, but that's why you often see central bankers, myself included, say things like, you have a really good point there about inequality. And I believe me, I'm actively taking that into account. What that means is I won't be that happy if we just kind of get back to where we were. I'd be happier if we got to a little bit better than where we were. And if there's a different path I can take to get us there, then I'm going to try to take that into account and try to engineer it. I'm going to lean this way or that way. But it's not the same as imposing a strict trade-off between this or that. It's more a channel of influence, and it's like taking into account the long-term effects of the things you're doing today. So for instance, if we were to go back slowly back to where we were before, like we did over 28, 9, 10, 11, look how long it took us to recover from the financial crisis. It was literally not even in 2013, we weren't back. So what that means is that length of time means there's people not getting the job they want, they're into the wrong job, they're losing their skill set. So you get this scarring effect. And when you get there, the level of well-being is not as good as it would have been if you'd been more aggressive and got there faster. And that's when you go faster, then people start worrying about you're going to put pressure and cause inflation, like we're seeing around the world. So then in that sense, there's a dynamic trade-off of a risk management problem. Yeah. And so when you're down below where you want to be, I think going at it in such a way, taking account of that long-term destination, means embracing some of the things that you're raising. Those are just indicators of how that long-term destination could be affected by those actions. It's not the same as saying, oh, I'm responsible for income inequality now. Yeah. It's not like that at all. It's saying that we may, at the margin, have a contribution to make to that, acknowledging that, by the way, it's still mainly the job of government to have, redistributive tax policies and not have tax policies that frustrate companies so that they no longer create jobs and those kinds of things. It's a very complex problem. And you're talking about a single little thread running through that, of this amazingly complex fabric.
I think you really have shed some light on the nuance of all this. We don't need a hammer. We need really wonderful to have you with us, Stephen. And we look forward to the book coming out, I think, next February.
That's right.
The Next Age of Uncertainty, How the World Can Adapt to a Riskier Future, from a guy who is a self-confessed optimist. So thanks again for being with us. Stephen Poloz, former governor of the Bank of Canada, now and a special advisor at Osler, Hoskin, Harcourt, and on the board of directors of Enbridge. And our thanks to Government Analytics, to Greg and Steve for making this all happen. Thanks to all of you for joining us, and we'll see you again next time.
And that's why Government Analytics takes the time to crunch the numbers, to dig and discover the real story, the data story. Thank you for joining us on The Monthly.